It is now my pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. And I know you've read her bio in the program. I think that we are really in for a treat this morning. Just raise the bar a little bit. I think we're really lucky that she was able to join us today. So Jessica Bacal is the first director of the Wurtele Center for Work and Life at Smith College. Her work is focused on teaching leadership skills, life skills, stress reduction, and reflection, asking students to think about questions like, what is your story? Where have you been? And where are you going? What matters to you? I think that these are questions we all might want to ask ourselves. She's the author of Mistakes I Made at Work, 25 Influential Women Reflecting on What They Got Out of Getting It Wrong. Influenced by her experiences with students and from her own steep learning curve as she transitioned into higher ed. The book includes interviews with high-achieving women from a variety of fields, and before arriving at Smith, she was an elementary school teacher in New York City and then worked as a curriculum developer and consultant. She has a bachelor's degree from Carleton College, an MS in education from Bank Street College of Education, and an MFA in writing from Hunter. Her writing has appeared in Brain, in Child, the magazine for thinking moms, on the Huffington Post Women, and in Inside Higher Ed. Please join me in welcoming this morning's keynote speaker, Jessica Bacal.
My microphone. So this is so exciting. I'm so happy to be here. Gloria Steinem is a famous Smith alumna, so I feel like that was a good reference to kick things off. I want to thank Patricia Aceves and Taisha St. Ville who organized this. We had a lot of emails back and forth for them to get me here, and I just am so honored to be keynoting for you. I'm from New York, and both my parents grew up on Long Island, so this feels very comfortable to me. Feels like being home. So I'm going to start by, I should get my clicker too. I'm going to start by telling you about my background and about how I came to write the book. And then I'll share 3 stories of women I interviewed and kind of unpack those stories and think about them in the context of the latest social psychological research on resilience. If I get to the end of the talk and you think, wait a minute, she didn't tell me what to do if I actually make a mistake at work, you're kind of right. I think every mistake is different. Our work contexts are different. Our colleagues and bosses are. You're coming here from so many different work contexts. And I think we can all agree it's useful to acknowledge mistakes and apologize and do what we can do to fix them. And to me, those are some of the more external, concrete responses. If you read the book, there's a lot of good advice from the people I interviewed who also come from a variety of work backgrounds. But today, I'm going to be talking about our internal responses to mistakes. So how we feel about making them in the first place, how we feel when we make them, what we think about what we feel, kind of the stories that we tell ourselves about mistakes and how we can change those stories. So first, a little about me. I'll tell you, this is how the talk is going to go. I always in my life avoided mistakes. My undergrad degree was from Carleton College, and I went there thinking I was going to be an English major, and I was an English major. And when I had to take classes outside of my comfort zone, because I had to, it was required, it didn't go that well. I remember a math class when I sat staring at the numbers on the board and just feeling panicked. I remember getting a C, or maybe it was even a D, on a psychology exam, and going and sitting in my professor's office to go over the test and just tears streaming down my face. So I was not that resilient. As graduation neared, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I got an entry-level job at Parents Magazine as a fact checker, and learned skills that I still use today about keeping track of where I get my facts. But I'll never forget, there was this one editor who I really loved and felt very connected to, and I'll never forget being reprimanded by her. I must have messed up with one of my facts. And I remember standing in the doorway to her office and her telling me about something I'd done wrong. And then I went home and got so physically sick. I came down with a terrible ear infection that, looking back on, I think of it almost as a physical manifestation of like hearing a mistake. Like it just made me sick. So about 10 years ago, I was at a work crossroads. I was married, I had a baby, and my husband was from the Five College area in Western Massachusetts, and we decided to move up there. And I got an entry-level job at Smith. And I loved it. I did really well at Smith, I think partly because I was just really interested in what we were doing, which was working to develop reflective experiences for students and helping them to become more comfortable with the questions that come up as you're graduating from college. Is there a buzz on this mic? Is everything okay with the mic? Okay. And I think part of the reason that that I loved it is it just really resonated with me, with all the questions that I had grappled with and was kind of still grappling with. And eventually that work evolved into creating an integrative center for students, and that's the Wurtele Center for Work and Life that I now lead. But I'd never worked in higher ed, and it's its own culture, as many of you know, and I made mistakes. So here's an example. I felt really intimidated when I had to speak with faculty, and my boss had a leadership program. It was like going to be a concentration, kind of a mix of practical and academic experiences that she was developing, and she wanted to kind of pitch it to faculty and get a sense of what they thought. So we had this proposal, and she told me, you're going to go meet with these faculty members and sit down with them and give them the proposal and answer their questions. Well, I was really nervous about it. Also because faculty at Smith and perhaps here were very ambivalent about the idea of leadership to begin with. You know, people, it's almost like saying religion. I mean, you can interpret it in so many different ways. And to many faculty, you know, to them it calls to mind, you know, imperialism and going in and telling people what to do. So the meeting was coming up, and I got a call from my daughter's daycare saying that she wasn't feeling well and that maybe I should come pick her up. And I thought, oh, I might get to skip this meeting. So here's what I did. It gets worse. I turned to my assistant who had just graduated from Smith, Allie, and she was about 21, and I said, Allie, how about you just take the proposal and you go to the meeting, because it was coming up. It was going to be in like, you know, half an hour. You go to the meeting and give the proposal to the faculty, and you can just answer any questions that they have. I went and I picked up my daughter. At the time, I think my husband was a teacher, so it just wasn't an option for him to run out and pick her up. And my daughter was fine. The next day, I asked Allie how'd it go, and she said, not that well. I gave them the proposal, and they started looking through it, and then they had questions, and I couldn't answer the questions. And I was like, okay, well, thanks for doing it anyway. And I didn't mention it to my boss, but of course she found out. And at our next one-on-one, she said, I heard you sent Allie to the meeting with faculty to present my proposal. What were you thinking? And I just didn't have an answer. What was I thinking? I couldn't say to her, well, I was too scared to do it. And so I realized in that moment, yeah, that had been a real mistake. My boss said, we're going to table this because that was a really bad way to kick things off with faculty. I just felt horrible. And essentially, I'd made the mistake because I wanted to avoid making the mistake. I didn't want to be with these faculty members and kind of be stumbling over my words or somehow inarticulate. I don't even know what I was worried about, but just my own worry had put me in a position of making a big mistake. Now, Maureen, my boss, she's now retired. She forgave me. She was a very forgiving boss. We remained very close. We just presented together last week at a conference. Allie, my assistant, went on to become a real collaborator in developing the center. She led programs, and only recently, in the past few months, just left because she got a record contract with Atlantic. She's now a rock star. Her band is called, Move It Up? Okay, let's see. See if we can, I can also use that mic if that's better. Okay. How's that? Is that better? This will go in my next book. All right. Is that better? Okay. So you can turn the volume down so it's not so buzzy, maybe? Okay. Anyway, yes. So Allie's band is called Potty Mouth, and they're really good. So I highly recommend downloading their record on iTunes. Anyway, we all were fine, but it was definitely like a low moment. And that was not the only mistake, and I'm still making them. But I was nervous about mistakes, and interestingly, so were the Smith students. And as you may know, Smith is a women's college. They talked about feeling like everyone around them was doing everything right, like they were the only ones messing up. And in one of our workshops, a student talked about this by saying she felt trapped by these constant expectations and pressures, by needing to live up to multiple personas, feeling the need to satisfy everyone. She wrote, "You find yourself always trying to find the right answers, the right behaviors, and the right opinions that aren't necessarily yours." In my work, I had been asked to focus on leadership development. And I was learning that a key finding in the research on leadership and success was that top leaders are people who can make mistakes. So Daniel Goleman, the psychologist and journalist, talks about great leaders having a thirst for constructive criticism. Angela Duckworth, who's at University of Pennsylvania, you may know her work on grit. And that's just all about kind of, she's done these measures of very successful people and how gritty they are. And a lot of it is just being able to persevere through mistakes and setbacks. But I was starting to realize that leaders weren't talking enough about this part of their own development. As I started my job, I was sent to a leadership conference, like a training. And at the end, there was a panel in which women were asked, can you talk about a mistake you've made in your career and what you learned from it? And I waited, I was making a lot of mistakes. I just waited there with my pen poised, ready to write these down. And they said things like, you learn more from your mistakes than you do from your successes. Or, mistakes are so important. But they didn't share stories. And then it happened again. There was, as part of a Seven Sisters conference, there was a big kickoff with congresswomen in DC. This was a panel the opening was led by Hillary Clinton, and then there was a congresswoman moderating a panel of women in government. The very first question was, can you talk about a mistake you made at work? A woman in the military said, oh, we don't make mistakes. And another woman said, I majored in the wrong thing in college. And I think, we can all understand these were people who were put on the spot. They were in front of high-level peers. And it's hard to come up with a good story on the spot. But, I was new in my job. I felt like I needed these stories. And students did too. When we had Rachel Simmons, the leadership educator, come and tell the story at Smith of becoming a Rhodes Scholar and then dropping out and the shame she felt. Students were riveted. They were lined up waiting to talk to her. They really responded to the actual story of her failure. So there's a saying in writing workshops, write the book you want to read, and this is what I wanted to read. I wanted to read stories of mistakes, and so I pulled together what I needed to write a book proposal, and I got an agent and who sold the book, and then suddenly I was in this position of being like a conduit for the mentorship that these women who agreed to be interviewed were willing to offer. And so now I'm going to share a few stories from the book and just unpack them to talk about kind of what I take away from them. This is Anna Holmes. She's the founding editor of Jezebel.com, which they started thinking about what is the kind of magazine that its own female editors would want to read. So, the people who came together to work on this were used to working at places like Glamour and top 10 ways to please your man type of articles, and she wanted to have a magazine that with articles women would want to read. Salon.com called it feminism, politics, and high culture, effectively mixed with pop culture, comedy, and low culture. There's over 1 million visitors a month to Jezebel now, and Anna Holmes left Jezebel. She writes for the New York Times and the New Yorker now, but her Twitter feed was recently named like one of the top 10 Twitter feeds by the Daily Beast. So she's very successful. But I'm going to tell a story from earlier in her career. So her first job out of college was being the assistant to a top editor at a weekly entertainment magazine. And she was supposed to open her boss's mail and get the coffee. But another part of her job was getting to sit around every week with these other assistant types and pitch story ideas. And she wanted to be a writer. So this was really exciting, kind of being a little bit generative, throwing out ideas, seeing what her boss liked. And at first it was really fun. But pretty soon, these 3 kind of cool kids emerged. They were the ones who the boss seemed to favor, whose ideas the boss liked. And Anna Holmes was not one of the cool kids. She had a lot of ideas, but she told me her enthusiasm and continual stream of ideas branded her as someone who wasn't as stylishly aloof as some of her coworkers. Now remember, this was New York City, so we all want to be stylishly aloof. She finally got the go-ahead to write and report a feature story, so this was really exciting. She was going to get her name on a longer piece. But when she gave the draft to her boss just said, no, this isn't working. Just no suggestions for revision, no mentorship. And Anna Holmes told me that, she said, because I wasn't being embraced in the way I'd hoped for, I remember feeling vulnerable and disappointed, thinking maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not as sharp as I thought. Looking back, though, she understands that her boss was 30 and maybe wasn't really accustomed to mentoring. Maybe she didn't know how to be a mentor. She was also in a very male-dominated environment, and it might be that mentoring young women wasn't being modeled for her. But she had no sense of that at the time. She just felt awful. And it soon became clear that even though she thought she was doing very good work, she wasn't going to get promoted, and she went on and got a different job. Later, though, those mile-a-minute ideas are what allowed her to make Jezebel succeed, because if you've been on Jezebel.com, there are multiple stories posted like every 15 minutes. And that's the kind of mind she had to have to make that work. And Holmes says she wishes she could go back to the person she was at 21 and say, you'll be fine. This is not the way every boss is. The way she's acting has nothing to do with your talent and potential. So I'm going to unpack that. Essentially, she's wishing that she had more self-compassion. And there's a whole new body of research revealing that when we're able to be kind to ourselves, it's a lot more helpful than when we beat ourselves up. Kristen Neff at UT Austin is one of the most productive researchers on self-compassion right now, and she defines it as treating ourselves with the same kindness, care, and compassion we'd offer to a good friend. Rachel Simmons, who I work closely with now, talks about your BFF voice. Like, how would you talk to your BFF, which I really like as kind of a shorthand way of thinking about this. And it's also kind of mindfulness. There's 3 components, which I won't go into, and Kristen Neff has a great TED Talk on this, but part of it is just saying to yourself, you know what, this is really hard for me. I'm having a hard time, and just being nice to yourself. And it's actually a lot of work. So when you're beating yourself up about a mistake or about something at work, the way that Anna Holmes did, it can be a real conscious effort to put away your inner critic and practice self-compassion. But this is something that actually can help you become more resilient. And some people might say, oh, but I get better with that voice that beats myself up. Oh, you're not good enough, work harder. There is research that shows that actually, no, that's not helpful. That makes people kind of more stressed. It decreases productivity and creativity. It's self-compassion that allows us to be more generative, more flexible, more resilient. Yes, so practicing this, it does take practice. And I'm going to talk about practice in relation to the next story I share. This is Dr. Carol Dweck. She's a Stanford psychologist, and you might have read her book, Mindset, some of you. She studies the ways in which our beliefs about our abilities affect how and what we learn. And it all started because of her concern that although she'd always been seen as a smart person, that she was always at risk of losing her smart person status. So here's a story about her. In graduate school at Yale in the late 60s, she was studying psychology, and there was a professor she greatly admired, Seymour Saracen. And she was particularly interested in him because he did a kind of applied research. Then one day, she was sitting in her advisor's office, and her advisor said, Seymour Saracen thinks you're really, really smart. She felt great. She sat there just basking in the approval of Seymour Saracen. But after that moment, she never took another class with him. She avoided Seymour Saracen for the rest of her graduate career because she worried that if he really got to know her, he wouldn't think she was as brilliant as he already thought. She already had his approval, and she didn't want to lose that. And now, looking back, she sees it as a real loss because she could have done research with him, she could have been mentored by him. So she sees it as a shame that she avoided him. The irony is that in her research, Dweck was starting to look at how people cope with failure. So here's what she was doing in her lab. In one of her earliest experiments, and you may have heard of these, they gave 5th graders puzzles that they could make harder or easier, in the moment. And when some kids got puzzles they couldn't solve, they just said, I can't do this, and they stopped working. When other kids got puzzles they couldn't solve, they said things like, oh, this is my favorite kind. And difficulty motivated them, and they actually worked harder, and sometimes ended up solving things they shouldn't have been able to solve. These were all kids who were at the same level. So Carol Dweck wondered, why did some kids see failure as meaning, I can't do this, that they lacked ability, but others saw it as an opportunity to learn? And she thought, maybe ability itself has different meanings for these kids. Those who wanted to validate their ability through solving the puzzles correctly were seeing it as a fixed thing, like you either have it or you don't. You show your ability to the world passes judgment, that's it. And those who wanted to grow their ability, who kept working on the puzzles, saw it as more dynamic, something that could be developed. So she created this theory that's been replicated by researchers all over the world, that mindsets about ability affect learning. So with a fixed mindset, you value looking smart over learning, and you think effort is bad, because if you have ability, you shouldn't have to put in effort. And you think your failures define you. So, those kids working on the puzzles, it's like, oh, I can't do this. This clearly means I don't have the ability to solve this puzzle. The other kids, the ones who kept working, had a growth mindset. They were valuing learning and effort, and seeing their mistakes on those puzzles as tools for learning. Oh, I did it the wrong way. Let me try it this other way. She actually has a whole curriculum for middle schoolers that's kind of amazing, and there's a website that goes with this that teaches kids that persevering and practicing can change your brain. You develop new neural pathways. So it's about learning that practice helps you learn, but that's because it actually has an effect on your brain, on your muscle memory. It turns out that people who have a growth mindset take on more challenges, bounce back from setbacks, and have higher achievement. That's what her research has shown, and that of other people's. But when she started doing this research, the received wisdom was that ability was static. Like, it was just your IQ predicted your ability. And she knew that she was taking a risk. She was, for the first time really in her career, taking a risk by pursuing this. So, what was at stake was her position in the academic community. She was already publishing and doing really well. Her research was accepted. And she had all these grad students who would need to publish to get jobs. So she was actually putting their careers at risk too. But she knew she had to pursue this, in order to grow as a person and in her career. And I think her theory is really useful for any of us who want to grow in any way, like at work or outside of work. So I'm going to share a growth mindset story of my own, but I was going to invite you first to just think about something that you've learned through practicing. And it can be like Zumba steps, it can be knitting, playing guitar. It might be something at work, like writing a certain kind of report, or learning a tool that you need, a technical tool. Just something you've learned through practice. And then think about something else in your life that is feeling harder to learn. It might be parenting a toddler or a teenager. It might be working with a new colleague or a new boss. Are you fixing the buzz? Okay. So how can you take that approach, that she sometimes calls it the incremental approach, like learning little by little. How can you take the incremental approach and apply it to that hard thing and have a growth mindset about that thing that's hard to learn in the same way that you did about the other thing? I could also just talk without the mic, if that's better. Okay, all right. For myself, the thing that one example of having a growth mindset is, I grew up in New York City, and I didn't drive. And I just thought of myself, it's like, I'm not a driver, I can't drive. But then I moved to Western Massachusetts, and I had to drive to get around. And, I just had to tell myself, like, okay, getting on the highway, the first time it's gonna be hard, the more you practice, you're gonna get better. Or parallel parking, you're just gonna get more comfortable. Your body's gonna remember. And that's really true. I'm a pretty good parallel parker now. So, I just thought to myself, like, oh, I can really apply this. This is ridiculous. I just can't say to myself, I'm not someone who drives. This is something I can learn. So far, 2 takeaways: self-compassion and growth mindset. And now, this is my final story. So this is Reshma Sujani. Her family came to the States in 1972 as refugees. They had been living in Uganda, and all Indian families were told by Idi Amin they had to leave. They moved to the Midwest. She was one of the only Indian families in her town and experienced a lot of prejudice and bias and was doing anti-bias work very early on, and starting at age 13. She helped develop the Asian American Cultural Studies Center at her college. She went on to Yale Law School. She worked on Bill Clinton's campaign in 1996, and by 2002, she moved to New York and was working as a lawyer, and was also doing a lot of work in a particular district in Queens, getting South Asians to register to vote. In 2009, she decided she wanted to run for Congress and to unseat the congresswoman who had that district that was a very largely South Asian district. And she got together a lot of young people who were super excited about her campaign and who worked really hard, and there was a lot of optimism. She told me the story about the night of the election. They all gathered in a hotel room to watch the results come in on TV. And she was sitting there with her, all this enthusiasm in the room, and she hadn't even written a concession speech because she was so hopeful. At first it looked okay, and then the numbers from the polls started coming back and looking less okay, and someone on her staff said, "We're going to need to write a concession speech." And she said, "No, I think it's going to be okay." She was just feeling horrible inside, but she said, "I think there's still hope." But she did have to write that speech, and she had to go out and tell the people who had supported her, "I'm sorry, thank you for your support." And she held it together. The minute she got home, she felt devastated. She just let herself feel awful. She had put everything into this campaign, all her personal savings. She had made promises to voters. And this was what she wanted. She didn't have a plan B. So she felt pretty awful. But she did a really smart thing, which is she gave herself 2 weeks to feel terrible. And then she told herself, I'm going to move on. So 2 weeks to cry, 2 weeks to, as she says, to harass everyone around her about what went wrong. And then it was over. And when it was time to move on, one way that she was able to move on was to affirm what was important to her. So she knew she valued government and politics, and that she wanted to serve the public and change policy. And she said, even within the first week after I lost, I knew I wanted to continue in public service. She just didn't know what form it would take. So she ended up becoming deputy public advocate in New York City, and in that role, she saw something that she hadn't realized was a problem before, which was that New York City kids didn't have access to training in coding and tech. And she saw that this was especially a problem for girls, that girls weren't going on to pursue tech after high school, they weren't majoring in tech in college. And she founded an organization called Girls Who Code, which you might have heard of. It's become extremely successful. So I think takeaway number 3 is really a question, and it's about what's most important to you. And in fact, the latest research shows that even writing a paragraph or 2 about what you value most, what's most meaningful to you, can make you less defensive and more resilient in the face of mistakes and setbacks. In this psychological research, it's called values affirmation intervention. And some researchers think that the reason that it works to make people less defensive is it helps them transcend concerns about their own self-image or their own self-worth. It kind of takes you out of yourself to think about something larger. So Reshma Saujani lost the election, but she maintained that sense of what she valued, and I think we can all, take a lesson from that and do the same. There's value in thinking about your values. So those are 3 of, I think, the most important takeaways for me in the book. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see it's divided into narratives that are about taking control of the stories are taking control of your own narrative, learning to say no, learning to ask, and learning resilience. So these are really lessons, those are the sections I had to come up with for my editor. And that made sense at the time. But this is really, upon reflecting on really what I take away personally from the stories and from the opportunity to interview these women, I think it's self-compassion, growth mindset, and affirming your values. I think these are really important. Next time you're getting ready to go in for a performance review or for a conversation with a colleague, just like sitting down and writing a paragraph about what matters to you, try it. I'm thinking about trying it. Like it can be helpful, apparently. And I'm sure you've heard the term lifelong learning, and I think that, learning to deal with our mistakes is really a lifelong process. So I gave a talk to college students recently, and they said, so someone asked, so when did you learn to do this? Like how, when did it become that you were not resilient, but now you are, you can do all these things? And I said to her, it's still a process for me. This is what I've learned, but I'm not saying like I always can do all of these things. And I think for all of us, it really is a process, as is leadership development. I think that we need to give ourselves room to make mistakes and room to learn from those mistakes. And I think that's the only way to be able to do it gracefully and to develop the leadership skills that we need. Thank you.